Why would a 58-year-old man be told, in front of his own son, that the mill he had been boiling syrup on for 40 years was a museum piece? The county extension agent, Dwight Merriman, gave the answer to that question on a February evening in the basement of the Overton County courthouse, in front of 40 farmers. His answer was wrong. Merriman pointed to a 6-acre flat on the aerial photograph projected on the screen, then turned to the man sitting in the front row. That man's name was Hershel Bilbrey, and the 94 acres on the screen belonged to him. Merriman raised his voice loud enough for the back row to hear. That mill was a good machine in 1910. In 1969, it's a museum piece with a horse tied to it. Your 6 acres brought $900 last year, Mr. Bilbrey. A man who put the same work into corn took home twice that. April is 6 weeks off. You've got time to think about it. Then he lowered his voice a little. And let me tell you the part that troubles me. Your son is watching you. Somebody in the back rows laughed. It wasn't cruel. It was the short sound a room makes when it agrees. 3 rows back, his 19-year-old son, Dale, looked down at the floor. Hershel didn't stand up, and he didn't argue. He asked one question. What temperature does your book say to pull it off at? Merriman didn't need to check the bulletin because he had written that page himself. 2:30, he said. Page 4. Hershel nodded and sat down, and a short silence went through the room because there was something in that question, asked by a man who wouldn't defend himself, that nobody there could put a name to. What Hershel Bilbrey didn't know that evening was this. The one question he had just asked would decide the fate of every syrup kettle in the county the following winter. What Merriman didn't know was heavier. He had written page 4 himself, the page he had just read out loud to the whole room. And that same page would wipe out a year's work for producers across 3 counties before another year was out. And Dwight Merriman would not be the first one to notice it. A year and a half later, he would drive his truck up this ridge and stand there talking with his hat in his hand. But that comes later. First, we need to look at how all of it started. Hershel Bilbrey had spent his life on a ridge in the Cumberland Plateau. Tennessee, Overton County, northeast of Livingston, a thin-soiled ridge sitting 1,840 feet above sea level. 40 of the 94 acres wouldn't hold corn and never had. But on the 6-acre flat below the ridge, sorghum cane had been growing for 40 years. His father, Hershel Bilbrey, had taught him 2 things. First, you save your own seed. Second, you never let another man do your measuring for you. Marion had never put them into sentences. He had simply done the same jobs in the same order every October while his son stood beside him and watched. When he died in 1961, what was left behind was the mill, the copper pan, and those 2 habits. In April, Hershel plowed the 6 acres. He didn't buy seed. He threshed it out of the heads he had set aside the previous October, because that was how most men who grew sorghum did it in those years. And it was the only reason the old cane varieties were still alive. When he walked into the field with the bucket in his hand, he thought about his father. Marion had made syrup for 40 years and had never used a thermometer until 1948. That year, he bought one in Cookeville, followed the number in the book, and ruined 2 batches back to back. Then he changed something. What he changed was so small that Hershel had been doing the same thing for 21 years without ever thinking of it as knowledge. In the first week of August, Hershel went down to the co-op store and asked for time. The storekeeper opened the ledger, stopped his finger on $840, and said, "I'll carry you till January, Hershel. But in January, this account closes." Hershel thanked him and went out. He didn't get in the truck. He stood for a minute and looked up at the slope. By the end of July, the 6 acres of cane had come up past a man's shoulder. In the second week of October, 11 families came up to the ridge. They called it a stir-off. One farm sets up its mill, the neighbors come, the cane is pressed together and the syrup is boiled together. They started in the dark. The men cut the cane by hand, pulled the heads by hand, stripped the leaves by hand. The mule walked the same circle until evening, and the 3-roller mill made the same groan on every turn. A greenish liquid ran down the spout and filled the pan. Wood smoke settled over the flat, and by evening it was in everybody's hair. At the far end of the pan, the women skimmed the rising green foam off with wire skimmers. If that foam didn't come out of the pan, the syrup came out grassy and bitter, and everybody standing there knew it. Hershel set the copper pan over the fire. Then he set a small pot of plain creek water on the stones, right beside the pan. Elmer Dishman looked at it once, then turned back to the cane. Nobody had asked about that pot in 21 years. Toward evening, the syrup thickened. The bubbles got bigger and slower, the color turned from green to amber, and the talking on the flat stopped on its own. This wasn't like the silence in the courthouse basement. This was the silence of people watching the last 10 minutes of a job. Hershel bent over the small pot first and read the thermometer in it. 208. Then he looked at the one in the syrup and waited. At 226, he took the pan off the fire. Dale was holding the ladle and didn't lower his hand. "The book says 230, he said. Hershel set the pan down on the stones, then straightened up. "The book was written in Knoxville," he said. "Water boils at 212 down there. Up here it boils at 208. Those 4 degrees belong to us, not to them. The thickness of a syrup is read off its temperature, and temperature is read against the boiling point of water, and the boiling point of water is not a fixed number. It drops 1 degree every 500 feet. The Bilbrey Ridge sat at 1,840 feet. Marion Bilbrey had learned this from nobody in 1948. After he ruined those 2 batches, he had set a pot of water beside the pan, boiled it, read it, and written the difference in pencil on the back of a Grange feed calendar. Dale looked at his father, then at the small pot, and said nothing that night. It made 640 gallons. It was the best batch Hershel had made in 40 years. The jars went onto the shed shelf in rows, and in the light coming through the crack of the door, they all held the same color. In the first week of November, Hershel wrote to the wholesaler in Nashville. The man's name was Ray Souder. The answer came 10 days later, and it was 2 paragraphs. Souder wrote that sorghum was falling, that the shelf life was unreliable, and that the goods out of the Upper Cumberland last year had given him a headache. In the last line, he thanked him. The store in Livingston took 2 cans that month. The neighbors on the ridge carried off their own shares, and the 600 gallons on the shelf didn't move. The man who had talked in that basement in February looked right by November. Dale packed his bag on the morning of November 19th. The bus out of Cookeville got to Nashville in 3 hours, and he knew somebody at the plant. Hershel drove him to the station. They talked about the weather the whole way. At the door of the bus, Dale stopped. "I'll be back in January," he said. Hershel said, "You will." He didn't say anything else. After the bus pulled out, he sat in the truck for a while, then drove back up to the ridge. That evening, he went into the shed, walked past the 600 gallons, and did what he did every year. He took his father's 1948 Grange feed calendar down off the shelf. The inside of the back cover was full of pencil figures, 21 years of them. At the bottom, he wrote this year's, 208, 226. Then he put the calendar back on the shelf and turned out the light. He had written those 2 numbers every October, and not once had he thought they were worth anything. In the first week of December, a truck pulled up in front of the shed. The driver was a peddler who worked 3 counties door to door, groceries and general stores. He looked at the shelf, lifted a jar to the light, and set it back down. $2 a gallon, he said. "I can't do better, because nobody's paying for sorghum this winter." Hershel didn't say anything. $2 was under his cost, and they both knew it. Then he opened the shed door all the way. "Take 420 gallons, he said. The man counted the money out on the counter. $840. Not a cent more, not a cent less. The next morning, Hershel carried that money down to the co-op store and had a line drawn under the figure in the ledger. That should have been the end of it. He had sold at a loss. His son was in Nashville, and the mill sat cold all through January. At the end of January, Elmer Dishman knocked on the door. He was holding a can, and the lid was already off. "Take a look at this," he said. Hershel carried the can over to the window and held it up to the light. On the bottom, a finger thick, a layer had settled that looked like wet sand. The syrup had gone to sugar. "The whole batch?" Hershel asked. Dishman nodded and didn't speak for a while. Then he said, 130 gallons, all of it like that." A week later, a man from the other end of the ridge came up with the same can. By the middle of February, they were saying the same thing in Byrdstown and in Jamestown, and 6 producers in the Upper Cumberland had a whole year of work sitting in jars as sand. Nobody knew why. Souda's letter came in the last week of February. The same one had gone to every producer in 3 counties, and it was a single page. Souda wrote that goods were coming back from his customers, that a wholesaler could not carry a product that turned to sugar on his shelf, and that he would not be buying sorghum out of that region anymore. Hershel read the letter twice, then went out to the shed and opened 1 can out of the 180 gallons he had left. It was clear. There was nothing on the bottom. Seeing that didn't ease him, because the second question came right behind it. Was that luck? He knew the answer. But 4 months would pass between a man knowing what he knew and proving it. On the first day of March, he drove down to Livingston and knocked on the door of the extension office. Merriman let him in, offered him coffee, and heard him out to the end. Then he took a copy of the bulletin out of the drawer, opened it to page 4, and turned it around on the desk toward Hershel. "Mr. Bilbrey, that number is not a number I made up," he said. "It comes out of a state publication. There are 3 names under it, and every one of them has more years in this than I do." There was no mockery in his voice. There was the reasonable trust a man puts in his own source. "Your syrup may well have come out fine, and I'm glad of it. But if 6 men's goods went bad, the cause is technical, and the technique is written right here." Hershel was quiet for a while. Then he asked, "Have you got a pot of water?" They kept the hot plate in the back room for coffee. Hershel filled the pot and boiled it. He took his own candy thermometer out of his pocket, put it in the water, and waited. Then he turned the pot around toward Merriman. 208. Merriman looked, then looked again. "That thermometer's off," he said. Hershel didn't answer. He only pointed at the soil survey map hanging on Merriman's own wall. "The elevation of my ridge is on that map. Would you read it?" Merriman got up, went over to the map, ran his finger across the Bilbrey Ridge, and stopped. 1,840 feet. He said nothing for a long time, and that silence was not the silence of an embarrassed man. It was the silence of a man running a calculation backward for the first time. The boiling point of water is not fixed. It drops 1 degree every 500 feet. The state publication that Merriman's bulletin rested on had taken the sea level figure and put no elevation note under it. At sea level, water boils at 212, and syrup finishes 18 degrees above that, at 230. On the Bilbrey Ridge and all across the upper plateau, water boils at 208, which means the place where syrup finishes is 226. Boiling to 230 at that elevation means carrying the syrup 4 degrees denser than it ought to be. And the one thing that decides a syrup's fate is its density. Syrup that runs too dense crystallizes inside the can. Within 6 weeks, sugar settles to the bottom of it. Syrup that runs too thin ferments and molds. The window is narrow, and that window sits in a different place at every elevation. Merriman stood in front of the map and listened to all of it, then went back to his desk and put page 4 not in the drawer but on top of the stack. The reason nobody had caught this for years was not stupidity. Most producers didn't even use a thermometer. They went by how it sheeted off a spoon. And that test works on ordinary days, but it doesn't work ahead of a storm when the pressure drops. And ahead of a storm is exactly the day a man is hurrying to finish. The ones who did use a thermometer used the number in the bulletin. But none of that was the real trouble. Syrup doesn't go bad in the pan. It goes bad 6 weeks later in somebody's pantry. There are 2 months between the cause and the result, and 2 months on, nobody remembers what day that batch was cooked or what the weather was doing. The chain had broken, and nobody had gone looking for the break. Merriman was convinced, but the market wasn't. Souder had shut 3 counties at once, and he was not coming back for one man. On top of that, the 180 gallons Hershel had in hand proved nothing. At the beginning of April, standing in the shed door, December came back to him. 420 gallons scattered across 3 counties in a peddler's truck, set out on store shelves, gone into people's pantries. That syrup had been sitting in strangers' houses for 4 months. Hershel hadn't touched it, couldn't have picked it, couldn't have sorted it. The thing he had let go at a loss in the worst month of his life was the one piece of evidence he couldn't have tampered with. Souder only agreed to come after Merriman's second letter. That one had the elevation off the soil survey map in it. In the middle of May, he drove out of Nashville, came to Livingston, and chose for himself which stores he would stop at. He took 5 cans out of 5 shops, lined them all up on a table, and had them opened one at a time. All 5 were clean on the bottom. Then he stirred one with a spoon, lifted the spoon, held it to the light, and looked at it a long while. "Can you do it this way every year?" he asked. Hershel said, "I've done it 22 years. Souder took his book out of his pocket and wrote down a figure. $4.75 a gallon. That spring, Hershel had taken the cane from 6 acres to 8. In August, Dale got off the bus. He didn't say why he'd left the plant job, and Hershel didn't ask. He set his bag down by the door, sat in the kitchen with his mother that evening, and went down to the cane field the next morning before sunup. Dwight Merriman drove his truck up the ridge in September. He knocked, took his hat off, and held it in his hand. He didn't apologize. He wasn't that kind of man, and Hershel wasn't expecting it. He only said he'd had the bulletin reprinted. The fixed number on page 4 was gone, and 3 sentences stood in its place. Before you start cooking, boil a pot of plain water beside the pan. Read that day's boiling point, and take the syrup off 18 degrees above it. Then he asked, "Would you show it to me one more time? There's a meeting in Birdstown in November." Hershel took his hat down off the shelf. "Come in October," he said. "I'll show you while the water's boiling." That October, 13 families came up to the ridge. The mule walked the same circle. The mill made the same groan. The wood smoke settled over the flat again. But this time, 2 thermometers hung from the nail beside the pan. One for the syrup, one for plain water. And toward evening, the one who picked up the water thermometer and read it out loud was Dale Bilbrey. Merriman stood at the back of the crowd and took notes. 8 acres gave 880 gallons that year and brought in $4,180. A man in the same county putting 40 acres into corn was clearing somewhere around $2,900 gross, and after seed, fertilizer, fuel, and hauling came out of it, 1/3 of that stayed in his hand. 8 acres of cane had earned more than 40 acres of corn. The 2 numbers Marion Bilbrey wrote in pencil on the back of a feed calendar in 1948 had meant nothing to anybody for 22 years. Then, on a February evening in a courthouse basement, somebody called it a museum piece to that man's son. Maybe you have a piece of work like that too, something you learned from your father, from an old hand, or from somebody you stood next to years ago that nobody has ever asked you about. Or something you've done the same way for 20 years, without ever thinking of it as knowledge. Most of the time, a man only finds out what it's worth when somebody stands up and calls it unnecessary. If you have something like that, you can tell us about it in the comments. What makes these stories worth anything is what collects underneath them. And if this kind of story sits well with you, you can subscribe to the channel.